I want to thank you, first of all, for taking time out of your busy days to spend a few minutes with me. So what I'm planning to do today is to invite you sort of on a guided reflection and discussion regarding, first, the prevailing, what we call anthropology, or understanding of the human being, expressed within the Christian tradition. And second, we're going to look at what most sociologists would agree are the three dominant non-Christian anthropologies that we've inherited from our culture, which we call sort of as ideal types: community, society, and mass society. And then we're going to talk a bit about, having done those descriptive pieces, how these anthropologies, these understandings of the human being that we've inherited, either conflict or correspond with the Christian understanding of the human being, which should help us in our work. And I have some prompts and discussions that we will break out into along the way. Okay, so I'm going to begin by condensing a couple thousand years of history into just a brief description of anthropology of Christianity, or the understanding of the human person within Christianity. So in early Christianity, we have this agreement by the 6th century concerning basic agreement about who the human person was. And it really was based off of earlier discussions about the Trinity and God existing in three distinct persons who share the same essence or substance. And that's where we get the word person, is from these early theologians. So it's from this philosophical and theological tradition that a distinctly Christian understanding of the human being first emerged, which I think is best expressed by the philosopher Boethius, a Roman Christian philosopher in the 5th and 6th century. And he wrote famously, "The individual substance of a rational creature is what a person is." That's how he described a person. The individual substance of a rational creature. Now we're gonna untangle that as we move along. What he meant by that in sort of philosophical parlance is that the human person is existentially distinct from God and the rest of creation, and unlike all other non-human animals and God, understands and acts within the world on the basis of rational deduction. God, of course, doesn't need reason because he has a special species of knowledge that we don't possess. And so from there, the next big development in the Christian understanding of the human person is in the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas made the important contribution. He argued that human persons are distinguished from non-human animals by their capacity for free will, free choice, or free judgment. And he wrote, again, very famously, that the person signifies what is most perfect in all nature. That is, a subsistent individual of a rational nature. So in stark contrast to the earlier Greek and Roman understanding of the human person and how they flourished and behaved, Aquinas really systematized the Christian idea, that the human person, action, and flourishing were moved by God, of course, but also by the free choice of the person to make moral judgments. And that's what makes them distinct within creation. Aquinas believed, importantly, that simply being a human person in and of itself categorically confers a rational nature. So this is significant because he argued all the way back in the 13th century that a person doesn't have to actually ever make a free choice or a moral decision to contain sort of the capacity for reason and rationality, which distinguishes them and makes them special within creation. It is just their simple existence as being created as a human being that does that. Okay, we're almost done. The next decisive contribution to the Christian understanding of the human person occurred in the late 18th century, actually. Aquinas really, his ideas really carried through within Christianity until that time. And at that time in Western Europe, which is sort of our intellectual heritage in Canada as a nation state and sort of our political and economic system, economics and politics and social thought was strongly influenced by classical liberalism, which is the idea that, again, briefly summarized, private property protects individual liberty by transforming some of the power traditionally held by the state to a free market economy. So in other words, they argued and believed that people should be free, you hear this rhetoric today too, to work, employ, buy, sell, own, invest with as little restriction as possible, so that theoretically, at least, citizens can accumulate sufficient power in order to prevent their unjust control or abuse by the state. So this was the dominant sort of economic theory from the 16th through to the end of the 18th century in the Western world. And how this relates to us is that this idea about freedom and the person, it tends to support a low view of the human being. So famously, Thomas Hobbes, in his very famous book Leviathan, he wrote, "The value or worth of a man is as of all other things, his price, that is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power, and therefore is not absolute, but a thing dependent of the need and judgment of another. And as in other things, so in men, not the seller, but the buyer determines the price." Now, along comes Immanuel Kant in the later 18th century, mid to late 18th century, and he disagreed very strongly with the anthropology of classical liberalism. And he made this famous argument within philosophy he called the categorical imperative. And he said that this thing exists, sort of an absolute obligation to treat the human person as an end in and of itself, not to use them as an object. So he wrote that if any element of the human will is found to be an end in itself, that is, it exists only for its own purpose, then every person has to respect that thing and treat it as an end in itself. So in other words, he argues that if philosophers generally agree, and they did, that reason exists for its own sake, thinking rationally, it exists simply to move you from one idea to the next, to provide knowledge, and the human person is the only being in creation that possesses this particular type of knowledge and reasoning, then he argued it follows that the human person is an end in itself because of their rational nature in it being an end in itself. So it's not important to understand the ins and outs of that. He's a very difficult philosopher, but he then developed from that what's called the practical imperative, which is much easier to understand. And he said, act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. So what he means by that is, obviously, sometimes a person will be an object to us. That is, we will have an exchange with them. Someone will do something for us, and in that sense, they're an object. But he's saying they can't only be that. They have to first and foremost be understood as something that has their own special existence and dignity. So he went on. Another thing he wrote, it's worth quoting at length because it's shaped right down to today the Christian understanding of the human person. He wrote, in the kingdom, and he's directly refuting Hobbes here, in the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. What has a price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. What, on the other hand, is raised above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. What is related to general human inclinations and needs has a market price. But that which constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself has not merely a relative worth, that is a price, but an inner worth, that is dignity. Now, morality is the condition under which alone a rational being can be an end in itself. Hence, morality and humanity, insofar as it's capable of morality, is that which alone has dignity. So he argues that because we have reason, God gave us the gift of reason, which other non-human animals, philosophers generally agree, do not possess. And reason exists only to provide knowledge, moving from one thing to the next, to continually expand itself. He argued, every person, because we have this capacity, is an end in themselves. That means they can't be used just in a utilitarian way, as that would contradict the inherent dignity that people have as rational creatures. Okay, so where we are today in Christian anthropology really developed into basically its most mature current form in the Polish work of the Polish moral philosopher Karol Wojtyła, or Pope John Paul II. And Wojtyła was very strongly influenced by Kant. He argued that the person is a kind of good that is incompatible with using, very similar to Kant's argument, which may not be treated as an object of use, and in this sense, as a means to an end. The person is a kind of good to which only love constitutes the proper and fully mature relation. And he called this the personalistic or the personalist principle or norm. And he used these three statements, him and some other Polish philosophers in the school of thought, Polish personalism. They would summarize this idea. They would say the person ought to be affirmed for their own sake, or the person ought to be understood for their own sake, or the person ought to be loved for their own sake, not because of what they can do for us. But you would explain that on the one hand, the individualism espoused by idealism and classic liberalism, and on the other hand, the collectivism inherent within communism and fascism, both direct us to think about the human person mostly as an object or a means to an end, which robs them of their dignity. And so Wojtyła takes Kant's idea and he furthers it because he adds this idea that, yes, Kant's right, a person can't be used as a means. But then Wojtyła adds, the only way to do this is to act towards, participate with, or relate to the human person out of love. And so that's his contribution. Kant never really explained how to do that. How do you, and Wojtyła, long before he became Pope in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and he wrote a variety of books explaining this, which dominate sort of Christian anthropology today. So to summarize, it's a lot of philosophy. We're not going to be doing that much going forward. The anthropology of Christianity that we've inherited from our sort of spiritual ancestors is the understanding of the human person as a unitary, unique, and unsubstitutable being, possessing the faculty of reason, which carries with it the corresponding capacity to make free moral judgments, which then distinguishes them from the rest of the creation and makes them an end in and of themselves, with immanent, immeasurable, and irreplaceable worth or dignity, which requires relationships centered in love. So I guess I could have probably just began with this, but these five things summarize the current sort of state-of-the-art thinking of the human person within Christianity. And it's very different than most other understandings of the human person. So the first non-Christian sort of understanding of the human person, or anthropology, that we're going to look at is what we typically in sociology call community, as an ideal type. So I'm going to describe community a bit, and in doing that, we're going to unpack what implications that would have for how you view human beings in this anthropology. So community is the term sociologists conventionally use to describe the primary mode of human social organization from our earliest understanding of human civilization until about the 16th century, at least in Western Europe. Using Europe just as a template, because we have good information on that, and it is our political and largely our philosophical sort of inheritance. Prior to the 16th century, in Europe, Europe had a urban population density of about 5%. That meant that almost everyone lived in rural feudal estates. From the 9th to the 16th centuries in particular, most Europeans worked on the fiefdoms of either nobility or clerics. The church was the largest landowner in Europe at that time. And the nobility or clerics had permission to extract wealth from these lands, and the serfs were tied to that land and worked on that land intergenerationally. So those living under serfdom were inextricably and intergenerationally bound to the land where they were born. So much so that either formal laws or more often informal norms prevented even lords, even nobility, from separating serfs from their homes. It was just this idea, that's where you're from and that's where you will always be from. So serfs were generally tenant laborers who were paid in kind. That is, they usually kept a portion of whatever they harvested from the fief where they lived, and the rest went to the lord or the church. Just as a bit of a sociologist, we're trying to understand human context, and I was thinking about how diet has also changed, and it really has changed for technological reasons, economic reasons, but also for reasons tied to the human person, which I think you'll see as we move along. But the Northern European diet in the late medieval period, so like 13th, 14th, 15th century, was very heavy on cereals. Like over 50% of their calories were grain. And then a little bit of salted or pickled meat, cabbage, leeks in Northern Europe, hearty root vegetables, and dairy, milk and cheese, and curds. This will become relevant later when we compare how that's changed. So community is characterized by, more than anything else, a monism, a oneness of values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, desires, and behavior within a given social entity. In a community, identity is conferred through heredity. The possibility of voluntarily changing one's identity in a community would not even occur to most people because their identity conferred to them within their community is unambiguously coextensive with their nature as a human being. They understand those two things as one and the same. Everyone within a community acquires an enduring set of values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, desires, and behavior from their family and clan at the time of their birth. And this stable identity and social status is continually and deeply affirmed through a complex web of rituals that exist from cradle to grave. The strong sense of belonging and personal affirmation that is conferred by a secure identity and social status acquired from one's family and clan within a community produces very powerful, lifelong, reciprocal relationships with other members of the community, who they view as largely extensions of oneself. There's not a strong sense of separation between people. We don't really see the idea of people as individuals the way we understand it today, probably until Shakespeare in literature. It's kind of the first place we start to see this idea emerge. People within a community are greatly dependent of others for affirmation, care, nurturing, labor, resources, protection, and religious edification. The identity and social status of everyone within a community is crafted in cooperation with everyone else, resulting in deeply effective shared experiences. The tapestry that results from these processes produces a deeply communitarian social entity and predominantly tradition-directed personality. Not an individual personality, but orientation among people generally. This social entity and this personality is primarily concerned with maintaining stability for both oneself and the other members of one's community. People, objects, places, information within a community are, metaphorically speaking, solid and heavy. What that means is transportation, right? Moving of physical objects, culture, how that's transmitted, language and information moved slowly, infrequently, not very far, and with tremendous effort. In community, the human being is understood as fundamentally social. That is, human beings are believed to need one another in order to survive, let alone thrive. And their purpose is to interact with other community members within the boundaries of their inherited and hierarchical social roles. This is achieved through pursuing self-control, sort of stay in your station, preserving the rigid values, norms, beliefs, and attitudes, desires, and behavior of the community, the success of which is measured by community members' ability to maintain social solidarity. So we're going to move through Anthropology of Society and Mass Society. We're going to go through these same criteria and see how they change from, let's say, up to the 15th century, up to about the 19th, and then afterwards. So the next major sort of anthropology that we've adopted that continues to influence us in our culture is of society. And society is a term that sociologists conventionally use to describe the mode of human social organization that emerged in Western Europe beginning in around the 16th century, from where it was subsequently transmitted to most parts of the world and is now adopted as the primary mode of human social organization pretty much everywhere, except some very isolated communities. At the height of its industrialization, the urban population density of Europe rose to about 40%. Like the 1830s, 1840s, with enormous numbers of peasants migrating from rural to urban centers and transitioning from agrarian to industrial labor. In Northern Europe, urbanization and industrialization were closely related to the decision of the nobles to dismantle the system of serfdom so that they could kick the serfs off and rent their land to professional farmers who were applying more efficient methods and technologies. And as a result, could pay hefty rents. Serfs were not terribly efficient because there was no incentive to do better, because there was no, as long as you harvested enough to provide for your family, that was basically it. But a skilled professional farmer using modern techniques can yield quite a lot more. They didn't even rotate crops in much of the medieval world, so the soil was bad and so on. As a result of this change, a tremendous number of serfs were forced to either find work in European industrial cities or migrate to a colony like Canada. And this new class of industrial workers became intergenerationally migratory. They weren't connected to a place in the same way. And they were generally wage laborers. This was a big change. They were paid a wage, a salary usually, rather than in kind. So that had tremendous implications for how we live and work and everything. The diet of Northern Europeans at the height of industrialization relied heavily on bread. British agricultural workers in the 1830s and 1840s, for instance, spent 75% of their overall income on food and 55.5% of their overall income on bread alone. British factory workers during the same period fared a little better, only spending 60% of their overall income on food and 23% of their overall income on bread, while miners might have been the best off. They only spent about 58% of their overall income on food and 25% on bread. Bread was about 60% of their diet, and it was supplemented by bacon, very specifically, because it's a very consistent dietary staple throughout the Christian industrialized world because of obvious fat, protein, and preservative advantages when you're working intensely, right? As well as other meats, and that followed by dairy, tea, sugar, salt, and yeast. And coffee would come after that. And these are things that are starting to come to Europe as a result of colonization. So the thing that's interesting to note here, a dramatic decrease in the proportion of other types of cereals, right? Barley, other healthier cereals that were eaten in the medieval period, and vegetables were almost not eaten at all. Society is characterized above all else by a pluralism of values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, desires, and behavior. In an industrialized European nation state, for instance, we would find a wide variety of individuals representing an unprecedented number of appetites, passions, appearances, languages, ethnicities, nationalities, identities, worldviews, occupations, recreations, political ideologies, and religions. Huge expansion of these things. Identity is conferred to individuals within a society through voluntary association. Individuals are not born into a pluralistic society, but rather must exercise agency to join voluntary associations that help them to construct and maintain their identities. Individuals are also free to leave and attempt to join other voluntary associations, if they'll have them, that they believe might be able to offer them a preferable identity and social status. As a consequence, individuals in a society do not acquire the same quality of stable values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, desires, and behavior as do people within a community. Detached from their traditional communities, families, and clans, urban wage laboring individuals were forced to develop new ways of belonging and affirmation, which they largely found within the social process of social class. Social class was used to fill the void of identity and social status lost during the transition from rural agrarian serfdom to urban industrial capitalism by significantly expanding the previous medieval social class hierarchy, which was very limited: serfs, some trade people in the middle, clergy, and nobles. That's about it. In the industrial period, hundreds and hundreds of layers of stratified class systems. That's the one thing it did. The other thing it did was it permitted upward social mobility. Upward social mobility in the pre-modern world was basically impossible because your identity was largely ascribed at birth. There were some, obviously, examples of how that happened, but they were very rare. So in society, in a modern society, you can climb the social hierarchy through acquiring greater quantities or better quality of cultural, economic, and political capital, right? Things today we'd say, education, occupation, wealth, political connections, these kinds of things. The constant struggle to accumulate, impress, and secure one's footing on the highest possible step of the social class hierarchy in an attempt to fill that gaping hole left by the loss of traditional identity, social status, and affirmation produces highly instrumental relationships with other individuals within society who are viewed largely as a means to an end. Individuals within society are mostly independent of others, interact mainly to exchange products and services because the identity, social status, and affirmation of each individual is manufactured in competition with everyone else, resulting in coldly rational interlocking experiences. Again, the accumulation of all these processes produces a highly individualistic social entity and a predominantly inner-directed personality, which are preoccupied with maintaining the liberty of the individual. People, objects, places, and information are, metaphorically speaking, liquid and light. That is, transportation, physical objects, local cultures, and information move fast, frequently, far, and with little effort. In society, the individual is understood as fundamentally autonomous. That is, individuals are believed to exist outside of or separate from society. It's the first time in history people understood themselves separate from a social entity. And their purpose is to individuate, not in the psychological sense. That's a very healthy thing, individuate from your family, but individuate yourself from the social norms that within the society people view as trying to control them. And they do this by experimenting with sort of emergent, flattened social roles, right? Because of the ability to climb social hierarchy with accumulating education and wealth. This is achieved through pursuing self-interest or acquiring what one determines to be in their best interest in the best way, or whatever way that they think is best. And the success of which is measured by the either quality or quantity of emancipation from society that an individual has acquired. So this is getting more probably into familiar territory, because this now community still exists. It has influence in our culture, but the anthropology of society is much more dominant. So it's the one that we're all probably fairly familiar with in our work, in our life. But one that's over the last 100 years in particular, coming to dominate and even displace the anthropology of society is the anthropology of mass society. And it's even much more terrifying than the previous one. So we have this fear among elites, social elites, that the masses or the crowd, the herd, of the mob might replace authorities with majority rule. And I mean, this goes back at least to Plato, right? Who considered mob rule literally one of the four quintessentially flawed forms of government. But what sociologists understand mass society as is a little bit more specific. People really began to recognize it after the French Revolution. And the concept went under further development until the best analyses of it came out in the 1940s and 50s in the wake of the meteoric rise of fascism and communism in the early 20th century. So in 2018, just most recent information I could find that was reliable, the urban population density of Europe was 75%, with many countries exceeding that figure, such as Belgium, which had the greatest urban population density in the European Union at 98.5%. That's a big change from just even a 500-year span. In mass society, opportunity, power, and resources have been so heavily concentrated in a small number of locations that it's beginning to make more sense to think about what social scientists call global cities, places like New York, London, Tokyo, Paris at the head of the pack, but it could be anywhere. These transnationally connected cities that are actually probably the primary coercion-wielding entities in the world today, even more so than the nation states or corporations. It's now a truism within sociology that workers within mass society are becoming intergenerationally precarious. That is, not just moving, but not even being able to find a subsistence existence amid unprecedentedly frequent and rapid economic technological change, in which increasing numbers of workers are employed in emotional labor and paid according to productivity. So most of us, actually probably everyone who's here tonight, is paid primarily I shouldn't say primarily, a humongous portion of what we do is emotional labor. We're trying to elicit an emotional response or reaction in someone else. There's other pieces of what we do, of course, whether it's, a surgeon doing things, but if the emotional response is not right, there's tremendous consequences, right? A complaint to the college. For a student, a complaint, it can end someone's career if you don't create the expected emotional response out of your work. That's a big change from even sort of the industrial society period, when it was you're just paid for the job. Not much expectation that everyone's going to like what you do. Values are defined, again, by more than anything else, by standardization. Interestingly, about the diet, as you all very well know, about 65% of the typical diet, again, it differs from place, even regions, but typically more than 60% of the typical diet of the late 20th and early 21st century denizens of mass society consists of about equal proportions of cereals, fats and oils, and meat, poultry, and fish. Another 15% is typically comprised of sugars, 10% dairy, and about 10% fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and soy. And fruits and vegetables are usually less than 5% when you exclude fruit juice. So that's a big change, and it correlates very well with who we think we are and people are, and what we consume to reflect who we are, who we want to be. So the mass, the crowd, the herd, or the mob is characterized first and foremost by a standardization of values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, desires, and behavior, mass planning, mass production, mass communication, mass media, mass marketing, mass consumption, mass politics, mass religion, and mass transportation deliberately collapse the extensive pluralism that we found in society of appetites, passions, appearances, languages, etc., into a small, manageable number of crowds that can be simultaneously appealed to using the same shared symbols of a massed culture. If you want to get a bit of a popular culture idea of how that works, I haven't seen it myself, but my mother says it's great. But the television show Mad Men, when you have the advertising industry really develop after World War II in a big way, and their marketing in combination with psychological theory about people and personality, just a few types of people, right? And create cultures for just a few people, and you're slotted into one of these. Identity is conferred to members of the mass through involuntary selection. So today, most people aren't even really, you're not born into, and you don't even voluntarily join your crowd within mass society. Instead, the various mechanisms of mass society select, sort, and track members into one of a small number of standardized identities or personal brands generated by the mass. In the absence of stable families and clans or social classes within mass society, values, norms, beliefs, attitudes, and behavior are primarily attained through consumption. Consumption is probably the most important concept to understand to contemporary society. Members of the crowd are required to first build their identities and social statuses from scratch through the products and services that they consume. Second, have others affirm or negate the plausibility of these identities and social statuses through their approval or disapproval. And finally, constantly disassemble, modify, and rebuild their identities and social statuses according to the affirmative or negative feedback that they receive from others. It's like identity construction by opinion poll, which provides an extremely fragile sense of safety, security, or stability in a rapidly changing world. The constant state of anxiety, risk, and uncertainty that members of the mass experience as a direct consequence of their weak sense of identity, social status, and affirmation causes them to pursue mostly anonymous relationships with other members of the mass. Anonymous relationships do not confer personal human bonds, but rather impersonal, artificial affirmation. So we buy things and services to project an image of ourselves that we hope other people affirm to create an identity because we don't have one. We don't have a strong sense of identity at this point in our civilization. The members of the crowd are each highly interdependent of others. That is, they depend on the crowd to affirm one another's independent wants. But these wants are ironically dependent on the crowd for the creation in the first place. So it's a bit confusing. But again, the mass, these large institutions create ideas, visions of who we should be. And we depend on the mass to give us those because we don't have any solid identities, or many of us, I'm speaking generically, of course. Some do, but few do. And then we need other people to affirm that the one we've chosen, but really we haven't chosen it. It's a fiction, right? We're fooled into thinking we chose it. We rely on other people to affirm that so we can have a sense of who we are. Crowd members acquire identity and social status through their contagious affirmation and negation of each other's irrational shared desires. So sociologists are famously obsessed with using biological metaphors to describe social processes. But by contagion, what theorists of mass society usually mean is, because of the rapidity of communication that we have, instantaneous global communication, consumption of media, we can develop identity and status in ways that we don't really even understand. We see something, it's someone else, oh, that I really like that. And you really think that that person's opinion's valuable. And so you start to move in that direction with your identity. So it has this kind of unconscious, contagious type quality. That's just to clarify. And they're irrational, though, because we acquire our desires, our shared desires, from these large institutions, not from our own wants and needs. We fool ourselves into thinking that we want the things that we're told. Other people affirm it, and we think that it's us, but it's not, which is why we feel so awful all the time, because it's always changing, and it's never us being in the driver's seat to determine who we are and what we value. So this results in a significantly unconscious social entity. We're largely unaware of the extensiveness of our interdependence with each other. A lot of it's happening unconsciously underneath us, right? A good metaphor and even an example of that is the use of metadata, for instance. Like you just by having a cell phone, there's so much information that can be captured from you as you walk, that is actually captured from you as you walk down a city street, and that information can be used legally in Canada for a vendor or retailer to send you an advertisement literally within minutes, because they can tell where you're headed in that store, that product is coming up, right? So it's unconscious. We're so integrated with one another through technology and the way that we socialize now that we don't really even understand how we're doing all of this. And it has this kind of conspiratorial, when you actually do dig into how this is working, it seems crazy, because you think, well, this can't be true. This is so totalizing it. And then when you realize it is true, that's where we get these metaphors, conscious. Also characterized by a predominantly other-directed personality, right? We're preoccupied with how others affirm, think about us. And our society, the mass, is preoccupied with manipulating the crowds. We saw that, for instance. I have colleagues who work in, used to do a little bit of work in this, I don't anymore, but in radicalization, terrorism, public safety, these types of things. And we now have excellent evidence that confirms different nation states interfering with a variety of elections, including the last federal election in Canada, through social media, that is pushing people into silos of communities, largely made up of robot accounts that, through using artificial intelligence, generate scripts that help push them in a certain political direction. Like, this is a reality where we are today. People, objects, places, and information, metaphorically speaking, in mass society, are gaseous and weightless. Transportation, physical objects, local cultures, and information move extremely fast, unbelievably frequently, incredibly far, and with almost no effort at all, right? We're talking right now, we're doing something, I'm not even that old, and the idea that we could be doing this, I mean, this was fiction when I was growing up, right? And we're talking like the 90s, right? That we could do this and this would work and it wouldn't fail, communicate this way, and things move so quickly. In mass society, the herd is understood as fundamentally constructed. That is, the herd is believed to exist inside of or coterminous with mass society. We are part of this entity. We're not separate from it anymore. We may have the fiction that we're autonomous, but actually that's just a brand of identity that we've been sold by the mass, because we're not autonomous. We're controlled. Our purpose within mass society is to compartmentalize ourselves through the performance of an expanding ensemble of constantly changing social roles, which has the effect of rendering members of the herd essentially unknown to both others and even ourselves. This is achieved through pursuing self-abnegation, right? So it's not self-interest. It's worse than that. It's denying who we actually are as people by adopting a fiction that we think is something that we've had a agency in selecting. So this self-abnegation, sublimating our own self-interest for the interest of the mass, which are only disguised as one's self-interest, the success of which is measured by the extent of a member's conformity to the mass. Now, it's important, I'm done, but you're going to see some similarities here with community, right? Okay, so self-control, self-abnegation, not just doing what you want, conforming, stability, right? But what's different here is that in a community, there's not an entity over top, or entities, institutions, ideologies driving these things. The community actually comes to this stability on its own. Whereas in mass society, these are things that are pushed on us that we think we've selected. So it's nuanced, but it's very intentional. Particularly in political theory, they developed this idea of how to do this, and to sort of sell ideas of the self to people, and have them think that it's them who are selecting these things, when it's really a result of a complex web of relationships.